October 25, 1944 dawned with an ominous crimson hue over the Philippine Sea, as if the heavens themselves knew the blood that would spill before sunset. Commander Ernest Evans stood on the bridge of the USS Johnston, his knuckles white against the cold steel railing, watching the horizon through heavy rain squalls. What appeared through the mist made his heart stop. The largest naval force Japan had assembled since Midway, bearing down on the vulnerable American escort carriers like wolves descending upon sheep. The Battle off Samar, later historians would call it the most desperate naval engagement in American history, was about to begin with odds so lopsided that survival seemed a mathematical impossibility. Evans commanded a Fletcher-class destroyer displacing barely 2,500 tons, armed with 5-inch guns designed to fight submarines and aircraft. Racing toward his tiny vessel were 4 Japanese battleships, including the Yamato, the largest warship ever constructed, displacing 72,000 tons and mounting 18-inch guns that could hurl shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds over 25 miles. Behind Johnston and her sister destroyers, Hull, Heermann, and the smaller destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond, floated Taffy 3, a collection of 6 escort carriers nicknamed Jeep Carriers, or Baby Flat Tops. These vessels, commanded by Rear Admiral Al Clifton Sprague, carried critical air support for General Douglas MacArthur's landing forces at Leyte Gulf. They were slow, lightly armored, and utterly defenseless against battleship guns. The escort carriers could manage 18 knots at best. The Japanese battleships could chase them down at 30. Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the Japanese center force: 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. His mission was simple: smash through the American screen and obliterate the escort carriers, thereby cutting off air support and leaving MacArthur's invasion force exposed to annihilation. Kurita's force represented the last great offensive capability of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and they had navigated through the San Bernardino Strait during the night, exploiting a catastrophic intelligence failure that left Taffy 3 completely undefended by Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet battleships. At 0648 hours, lookouts aboard the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay spotted the distinctive pagoda-shaped masts of Japanese battleships on the horizon. Within minutes, 18-inch shells from Yamato began throwing up geysers of water as tall as buildings near the fleeing carriers. The situation was hopeless by every tactical calculation. Admiral Sprague later recalled, as documented in historical accounts from the Naval Historical Center, that his first thought was simply, "This is going to be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected." Commander Evans didn't wait for orders. At 0710 hours, without authorization from higher command, he ordered Johnston to attack independently, laying a smokescreen and charging directly toward the Japanese battleships at flank speed. His crew thought he'd lost his mind. A destroyer attacking battleships violated every principle of naval warfare. It was suicide dressed as heroism. But Evans, a Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma, who had told his crew on missioning day that their ship would fight until she sank, had already made his decision. He activated the ship's general announcing system, his voice crackling through speakers across the vessel. "A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. They are 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They are believed to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a number of destroyers. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." The impossible charge had begun. The Johnston's engines screamed as the destroyer accelerated to 35 knots, her bow cutting through the swells like a blade. In the plotting room below decks, fire control officers worked frantically to calculate firing solutions against targets that outgunned them 20-1. Lieutenant Robert Hagen, the gunnery officer, watched the rangefinders spin wildly as they closed the distance to the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano, Johnston's chosen target in a sea of giants. At 0720 hours, with the range down to 18,000 yards, Evans gave the order every man aboard had been dreading and hoping for: commence firing. Johnston's 5-inch guns erupted in rapid succession, their shells tracing orange arcs across the gray morning sky. Each gun could fire up to 20 rounds per minute, and the crews worked like machines. Posey, Sast, loading, firing, loading again until the barrels glowed red hot. The shells, mere 38 pounds compared to the multi-ton projectiles the Japanese were firing, somehow found their mark. Kumano's superstructure blossomed with explosions as Johnston's guns raked her bridge and forward turrets. Behind Johnston, the other destroyers of the screen were executing their own suicide runs. USS Hoel, commanded by Commander Leon Kintberger, peeled off to starboard, laying smoke and firing at the battleship Congo. USS Heermann, under Commander Amos Hathaway, positioned hers, Elf between the carriers and the Japanese cruisers, her guns spitting defiance at vessels 10 times her size. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, nicknamed Sammy B., commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, followed suit despite being even smaller and more vulnerable than the fleet destroyers. The Japanese, supremely confident minutes before, suddenly found themselves under attack from what they assumed must be full-sized cruisers or even battleships. No commander in his right mind would say, and destroyers charging into battleship guns. This confusion, documented in Japanese action reports translated after the war, caused Kurita's formation to break coherence. Heavy cruisers began evasive maneuvers, disrupting their gun solutions. Congo turned away from Hull's torpedo spread, losing precious minutes in the pursuit. At 0724, Johnston launched her full spread of 10 Mark 15 torpedoes from 5,000 yards, point-blank range in naval terms. The long lance torpedoes, each carrying 600 pounds of high explosives, streaked through the water at 48 knots. Evans didn't wait to observe the results. He immediately ordered hard left rudder, swinging Johnston away from the Japanese line while maintaining maximum speed. Behind them, 1, possibly 2 torpedoes struck Kumano's bow. The heavy cruiser staggered, flooding through massive holes torn below her waterline, and fell out of formation. But the Japanese weren't paralyzed. Return fire began to find the range. At 0730, the first Japanese shell struck Johnston's bridge. The explosion was catastrophic. A 14-inch shell from heavy sea Ike Grausertone penetrated the thin armor and detonated, killing several officers instantly and severing Evans's 2 fingers from his left hand. Blood streaming down his arm, Evans refused medical attention, wrapping the wounds in his shirt and continuing to command from the shattered bridge now open to the elements. More hits followed in rapid succession. An 8-inch shell destroyed Johnston's fire control director. Another penetrated the after engine room, killing everyone inside and cutting the destroyer's speed in H. Alf. Steam from ruptured lines scalded men alive. The smell of burning oil, cordite, and flesh filled the air. Yet the guns kept firing. Damage control parties worked miracles, shoring up bulkheads, fighting fires, keeping the remaining engine running despite impossibility. According to accounts preserved in the book, The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors by James Hornfisher, Johnston's sustained attack bought precious time for the escort carriers to launch their aircraft. Taffy 3's Wildcats and Avengers, many armed only with depth charges meant for submarine warfare, began their own desperate attacks on the Japanese fleet. Pilots made do MMI runs when they ran out of ammunition, trying to distract the battleships from the carriers. Through the smoke and chaos, Johnston continued fighting. She'd become a floating wreck, listing, burning, trailing oil. But her remaining guns never stopped. Evans maneuvered his crippled ship between the carriers and the Japanese cruisers, firing at anything that came into range. When asked by his executive officer if they should abandon ship, Evans replied simply, "Not yet." The tiny destroyer had wounded a heavy cruiser and thrown an entire battleship formation into confusion, but the price was mounting with every passing minute. By 0800 hours, the Philippine Sea had transformed into a hellscape of smoke, fire, and churning water. Johnston, trailing oil and listing heavily to port, found herself in the impossible position of being both hunter and hunted. Commander Evans, blood-soaked and partially deaf from the bridge explosion, continued orchestrating his dying ship's defiance with a clarity that bordered on supernatural. The Japanese heavy cruiser Chikuma, attempting to circle around Taffy 3's northern flank for a killing shot at the carriers, suddenly found Johnston limping across her path. Despite having only one functioning engine and half her guns out of action, Evans ordered a turn directly toward the 40 and 1,000-ton cruiser. His remaining 5-inch guns opened fire from 6,000 yards, each shell a desperate prayer wrapped in high explosives. In Johnston's forward gun mount, gunner's mate First Class Robert Billy and his crew worked through conditions that defied description. The temperature inside the turret exceeded 130 degrees. Cordite fumes made breathing torture. Yet they maintained a firing rate that manual records suggested shouldn't have been humanly possible. 23 rounds per minute from a gun designed for 15. The shells walked up Chikuma's hull, smashing her bridge, igniting secondary fires, and causing the cruiser to veer away from her intended course. Meanwhile, USS Hull had drawn the attention of Battleship Congo. Commander Kintberger, following Evans's example, charged the 40,000-ton monster with suicidal determination. Hull's torpedoes missed, but her guns found their mark repeatedly, damaging Congo's superstructure. The battleship's response was methodical and devastating. Shell after shell strew Kahe Hull, 14-inch rounds that punched through the destroyer like she was made of paper. By 0830, Hull had taken over 40 hits. Her engine rooms flooded, her guns silenced. She rolled over and sank, taking Commander Kintberger and over 250 crew members down with her. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts was also in her death throes. Despite being the smallest vessel in the American screen, displacing only 1,500 tons, Sammy B. had closed to within 4,000 yards of the Japanese cruiser line and emptied her torpedo tubes. Her 3-inch guns, designed primarily for anti-aircraft work, fired at heavy cruisers with desperate speed. Lieutenant Commander Copeland later described watching his shells bounce off cruiser armor like ping-pong balls, yet his crew never faltered. A Japanese heavy cruiser, likely Chokai or Chikuma, finally ended Sammy B's run. Multiple 8-inch shells penetrated her thin hull, one detonating directly in the forward engine room. The explosion literally lifted men off their feet and hurled them against bulkheads. Steam temperatures soared to over 700 degrees, killing everyone in the engineering spaces within seconds. At 0905, Copeland gave the order to abandon ship. Sammy B. rolled over and sank by the stern, her colors still flying, having fought for 2 hours against impossible odds. Back aboard Johnston, the situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. A Japanese destroyer squadron had detached from the main formation and was closing for the kill. Evans, now barely conscious from blood loss and concussion, ordered his remaining guns to engage the new threat. But Johnston had reached the end of her endurance. At 0910, a salvo from the Japanese destroyer Fujinami struck Johnston's remaining engine room. The explosion was so violent it buckled the deck plating. The destroyer lost all power, drifting to a stop in water now surrounded by Japanese vessels. Historical records from the Naval Historical Center indicate that what happened next was unprecedented in naval warfare. As Japanese destroyers closed to finish off the helpless Johnston, they observed what remained of her crew still manning the guns manually, trying to train them by hand-cranking the turrets. One Japanese destroyer captain reportedly ordered ceasefire and rendered a hand salute to Johnston as he passed, an extraordinary gesture of respect for an enemy who had fought beyond all reasonable expectation. At 0945, Commander Evans gave the order he'd sworn to delay until the absolute last moment: abandon ship. Men began throwing themselves into the oil-covered water as Japanese shells continued to strike the dying vessel. Evans helped wounded crew members over the side, ensuring his men escaped before considering his own survival. Multiple witnesses reported seeing him on the deck as Johnston began her final plunge, making no effort to save himself. At 10:10 hours, USS Johnston, hull number DD 557, slipped beneath the Philippine Sea, her battle ensign still streaming. She'd fought for 3 hours and 22 minutes against the most powerful surface fleet Japan could assemble, and she'd helped save every single escort carrier she'd been assigned to protect. Commander Ernest Evans went down with his ship and was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. As Johnston disappeared beneath the waves, the battle off Samar reached its critical phase. Admiral Kurita's massive fleet, which should have annihilated Taffy 3 within an hour, had been thrown into confusion by the destroyer's suicidal attacks. But the Japanese still held overwhelming advantages, and 3 escort carriers, Gambier Bay, Kalinin Bay, and Fanshawe Bay, were under concentrated fire from multiple battleships and cruisers. USS Heermann, commanded by the methodical commander Amos Hathaway, had executed perhaps the most audacious maneuver of the entire battle. At 0840 hours, Hathaway observed the Japanese heavy cruiser Haguro attempting to close on the carriers from starboard. Heermann was already damaged. Several near misses had sprung her hull plates, and she was taking on water, but Hathaway saw an opportunity that existed for perhaps 30 seconds. He ordered flank speed and turned Heermann directly toward not just Haguro, but toward the massive battleship Yamato herself. The maneuver put Heermann on a collision course with the 72,000-ton Leviathan. From Heermann's bridge, Yamato appeared less like a ship and more like a floating city, her massive 18-inch gun turret swiveling to track the impudent destroyer that dared challenge her. At 4,000 yards, so close that Heermann's crew could see individual Japanese sailors on Yamato's deck, Hathaway launched his torpedo spread. Then he did something that naval historians still debate. He held his course directly toward Yamato's bow, forcing the battleship to choose between maintaining her pursuit of the carriers or taking evasive action to avoid the torpedoes and potential collision. Yamato's captain chose survival. The massive battleship turned hard to port, her enormous bulk responding sluggishly to the rudder. The torpedoes missed, but Yamato had lost 8 precious minutes and fallen out of position. More critically, her turn had blocked the firing lanes of the cruisers behind her, creating chaos in the Japanese formation. Heermann emerged from the encounter, riddled with shell fragments, and with her forward gun mount destroyed, but still fighting. The escort carrier Gambier Bay wasn't as fortunate. The jeep carrier, commanded by Captain Walter Vuegg, had been hit repeatedly by shells from the heavy cruiser Chikuma. Unlike fleet carriers, escort carriers had virtually no armor. Their hulls were barely thicker than commercial freighters. 8-inch shells penetrated through her thin plates, exploding deep inside the ship. Her flight deck, constructed of unarmored steel, buckled under near misses that sent tons of water cascading across her hangar bay. At 0907, an 8-inch shell struck Gambier Bay's forward engine room, destroying the turbines and bringing the carrier to a crawl. She became a stationary target for every Japanese ship in range. Captain Vuegg, knowing the end was inevitable, ordered all non-essential personnel to abandon ship while damage control parties fought to keep her afloat long enough for the evacuation. Witnesses described Vuegg standing on the bridge wing, calmly directing the evacuation even as shells continued to pound his ship. At 0911, Gambier Bay capsized and sank, becoming the only U.S. aircraft carrier sunk by naval gunfire in World War II. Over 800 men went into the water, many wounded, all covered in the thick fuel oil that leaked from the carrier's ruptured tanks. Captain Vuegg went down with his ship, last seen on the tilting bridge as Gambier Bay made her final plunge. But Gambier Bay's sacrifice hadn't been meaningless. Her stubborn refusal to sink quickly had kept several Japanese cruisers occupied for critical minutes. During that time, the remaining destroyers and destroyer escorts continued their harassment attacks, and Taffy 3's aircraft, now landing on other escort carriers to rearm, maintained constant pressure on the Japanese fleet. The destroyer escort Dennis, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Samuel Hansen, exemplified the fury of the tin can screen. Dennis was a John C. Butler-class destroyer escort, even smaller than the Fletcher-class destroyers, armed with only 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedo tubes. By every measure, she had no business engaging heavy cruisers. Hansen didn't care about measures. At 0920, Dennis positioned herself between the escort carrier White Plains and the heavy cruiser Tone. The Japanese cruiser's 8-inch guns could have obliterated Dennis with a single salvo, but Hansen ordered his tiny ship to charge, firing her inadequate 5-inch guns as fast as the crews could load them. The attack was so unexpected, so contrary to rational tactics, that Tone's captain hesitated, uncertain whether this was a destroyer escort or perhaps a torpedo-equipped cruiser using smoke to mask her true size. That hesitation cost Tone the killing shot at White Plains. Dennis's shells, while incapable of penetrating Tone's armor, damaged her fire control systems and started fires on her superstructure. More importantly, Dennis forced Tone to maneuver evasively, breaking her gun solution on the carrier. By the time Tone's captain realized he'd been bluffed by a ship 1/10 his displacement, White Plains had opened the range beyond accurate fire. According to accounts documented by the U.S. Naval Institute, Admiral Kurita, observing the battle from his flagship Yamato, became increasingly convinced he was facing a force far larger than intelligence had suggested. The ferocity of the American attacks, the constant torpedo spreads forcing evasive maneuvers, and the swarms of aircraft all pointed to engagement with fleet carriers and heavy cruisers rather than the escort carriers and destroyers he actually faced. At 0925, Kurita made his fatal decision. At 0925 hours, Admiral Takeo Kurita transmitted the order that would save Taffy 3 and haunt Japanese naval history. All units, cease action, regroup to the north. The massive fleet that had been minutes away from completing the destruction of the American escort carriers suddenly broke off the attack and began withdrawing. Kurita's decision, made in the fog of war while under constant air attack and harassment from the surviving destroyers, was based on a catastrophic misreading of the tactical situation. From Yamato's flag bridge, the battle appeared far more chaotic than the one-sided slaughter it should have been. The destroyers' smoke screens had obscured accurate observation. Constant aircraft attacks, even when the planes had no ammunition and were making dummy runs, suggested carrier groups far larger than 6 escort carriers. The fury of Johnston, Howell, Samuel B. Roberts, and Heerman's attacks had convinced Kurita he faced fleet destroyers and possibly light cruisers, which meant fleet carriers couldn't be far away. Most critically, Kurita had lost track of time and position during the night transit through San Bernardino Strait. He believed he was engaging the powerful Task Force 38's fast carrier groups, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, rather than the vulnerable escort carriers of Taffy 3. The difference was enormous. Fast carriers displaced 33,000 tons, carried 100 aircraft, and operated with heavy cruiser escorts. Escort carriers displaced 10,000 tons, carried 30 aircraft, and had only destroyer escorts for protection. But in the confusion of battle, with his ships scattered across 20 miles of ocean, formations disrupted by torpedo evasion, and communication limited by smoke and electronic interference, Kurita couldn't distinguish between the two. The American destroyer's willingness to charge his battleships head-on had convinced him this was a force that knew it had heavy support nearby. No rational commander would sacrifice destroyers against battleships unless fleet carriers with their powerful air groups were over the horizon. He was wrong, but he didn't know it. Aboard the surviving American ships, disbelief competed with relief. Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from the carrier Fanshawe Bay, watched through binoculars as the Japanese battleships executed their turn northward. His first thought, documented in his after-action report, was that this must be a tactical maneuver to achieve better firing positions. Only when minutes passed and the Japanese continued retiring did he dare believe the impossible. They were retreating. Commander Amos Hathaway, aboard the battered Heerman, actually ordered his guns to cease fire and had his radar operators verify what they were seeing. The Japanese fleet was withdrawing. Heerman had fired over 600 5-inch shells, nearly her entire ammunition supply, and launched all 10 torpedoes. She was flooding, burning in 3 compartments, had lost her forward gun mount, and was down to 1 working engine. But she'd survived. Against all odds, against all tactical logic, she'd survived. The destroyer escort John C. Butler, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John E. Pace, had been damaged but remained operational. Pace ordered his ship to begin rescue operations immediately. The water around Samar was filled with hundreds of survivors from Johnston, Howell, Samuel B. Roberts, and Gambier Bay. Many were wounded, all were exhausted, and the tropical sun was already heating the oil-covered sea to dangerous temperatures. The rescue operation revealed the true cost of the battle. Survivors from Johnston numbered only 141 from her crew of 327. Commander Evans was not among them. Multiple witnesses reported seeing him still aboard as the ship sank, making no effort to save himself. His body was never recovered. Howell's survivors numbered 86 from a crew of 330. Samuel B. Roberts lost 90 men from her crew of 224. But Gambier Bay's survivors suffered the worst fate. Of the over 800 men who went into the water when the carrier sank, fewer than 600 were ultimately rescued. The remainder succumbed to wounds, exposure, or, in the horror that haunted survivors for life, shark attacks. The Philippine Sea was home to large populations of oceanic white-tip sharks, aggressive scavengers that are drawn to disaster sites. Over the next 30 hours, as rescue ships worked desperately to pull men from the water, sharks took a terrible toll. Sailor First Class Donald Beecher, rescued by John C. Butler after 18 hours in the water, later described the experience in interviews preserved by the Naval Historical Foundation. You'd be floating in a group, maybe 20 guys all tied together with life jackets trying to keep each other awake, keep each other alive. Then you'd hear a scream, and someone would just disappear under the surface. Pull on the line and it'd come up empty. Or worse, you'd pull up half of someone. The sharks were everywhere. We were too exhausted to fight them off, too tired to even care after a while. Back aboard Yamato, Admiral Kurita was receiving reports that deepened his misunderstanding of the situation. His heavy cruisers Chokai and Chikuma were heavily damaged and falling behind. Chokai had been struck by a bomb from a Taffy 3 Avenger and was burning uncontrollably. Chikuma, hit by Johnston's guns and possibly one torpedo, was listing and taking on water. The heavy cruiser Kumano, struck by Johnston's torpedoes at the battle's opening, had already withdrawn with her bow shattered. 3 heavy cruisers damaged or sunk represented a significant portion of Kurita's offensive power. What he didn't know, what the Americans' aggressive tactics had prevented him from discovering, was that the powerful carrier force he believed he was engaging consisted of lightly armed escort carriers that a single battleship salvo could have destroyed. Had he known the truth, had he pressed the attack for just 20 more minutes, Taffy 3 would have been annihilated, and the invasion of Leyte would have faced disaster. But he didn't know and he didn't press. At 1000 hours, Admiral Sprague sent a situation report to Admiral Halsey, who was 300 miles north chasing a Japanese decoy carrier force. The message was brief, but profound. Enemy force of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 11 destroyers engaged this unit at 0700 hours. Small boys have been in continuous action. Request immediate support. The small boys, Navy slang for destroyers and destroyer escorts, had won one of the most improbable victories in naval history. 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts had charged the largest battleships ever built, armed with guns that couldn't penetrate armor and torpedoes that missed as often as they hit. They'd fought with a desperation that bordered on madness and a courage that defied comprehension. And somehow, impossibly, they'd won. By 10:30 hours on October 25, 1944, the guns had finally fallen silent off Samar. The Philippine Sea, calm despite the carnage, reflected a sky clearing of smoke and rain squalls. Across miles of ocean, oil slicks marked the graves of sunken ships and hundreds of men clung to debris, waiting for rescue that would come slowly, painfully, and for many, not at all. Admiral Kurita's center force continued withdrawing northward, never realizing how close they'd come to achieving their objective. The Japanese admiral's after-action reports, translated by American intelligence officers after the war and now housed in the National Archives, revealed his conviction that he'd engaged a force of fleet carriers and heavy cruisers. He reported sinking 3 Cleveland-class cruisers, actually the destroyers Johnston Hole and Samuel B. Roberts, and 2 fast carriers, actually the escort carrier Gambier Bay and possibly a destroyer he'd misidentified. The scale of Kurita's misunderstanding was extraordinary. Every tactical indicator suggested he faced a relatively weak force. The ship's small size, their slow speed, their light gun calibers, and the absence of any heavy cruiser support. But the Americans' aggression had overridden those indicators. The charge of the destroyers, the constant torpedo attacks, and the swarms of aircraft had created the illusion of strength where only desperation existed. Japanese losses were significant despite their overwhelming initial advantage. Heavy cruiser Chokai sank that afternoon after burning uncontrollably, her magazines finally exploding and breaking her keel. Chikuma, flooded forward and unable to maintain speed, was caught by American carrier aircraft later that day and sent to the bottom with multiple bomb hits. Kumano survived long enough to limp toward Japan, but was sunk by submarine attack weeks later. 3 heavy cruisers lost, 30% of Kurita's heavy cruiser force, to an enemy that never should have threatened them. For the Americans, the battle's immediate aftermath brought the grim arithmetic of survival. Search and rescue operations continued for 3 days. Destroyer escorts and surviving escort carriers combed the battle area, pulling exhausted men from the water. Hospital ships worked around the clock treating burns, shrapnel wounds, broken bones, and the psychological trauma that would haunt survivors for decades. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, who survived Samuel B. Roberts' sinking, spent 19 hours in the water before rescue. His destroyer escort had been his first command, and he'd lost 90 men, nearly 40% of his crew. Years later, in interviews recorded by the U.S. Naval Institute's Oral History program, Copeland described the survivor's guilt that plagued him. "I kept thinking about the kids who didn't make it, boys 19, 20 years old who'd followed my orders straight into hell. I told them to fire at cruisers with 3-inch guns, to charge battleships in a ship made of thin steel, and they'd done it without question. How do you live with that?" The broader strategic implications of the battle off Samar became clear only in retrospect. Admiral Halsey's decision to chase the Japanese carrier decoy force north, leaving San Bernardino Strait unguarded, had created the crisis. Had Kurita pressed his attack for just minutes longer, the entire American landing at Leyte Gulf would have been jeopardized. General Douglas MacArthur's return to the Philippines, one of the war's pivotal moments, hung by the thread of a few destroyers' courage. Historians have debated endlessly what would have happened if Kurita had continued attacking. With Taffy 3 destroyed and American air support eliminated, Japanese battleships could have bombarded the invasion beaches at will. Ground forces would have been trapped without supplies or reinforcements. The Leyte campaign might have turned from an American victory into a catastrophic defeat, potentially extending the Pacific War by months or even years. But that didn't happen, because Commander Ernest Evans and his fellow destroyer captains charged when every tactical manual said to withdraw, because gun crews kept firing when their ships were burning around them, because engineers kept engines running with steam pipes ruptured and compartments flooding, because pilots made attack runs with empty guns just to distract the enemy. The awards and honors came slowly. Commander Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously, the first Native American in the Navy to receive the nation's highest military decoration. His citation read simply, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." The words seemed inadequate for a man who'd charged battleships in a destroyer and died ensuring his crew survived. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland received the Navy Cross for Samuel B. Roberts' stand. Commander Amos Hathaway received the Navy Cross for Heermann's impossible charge against Yamato. Dozens of Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and Purple Hearts were awarded to the crews who'd fought beyond all reasonable expectation. But the recognition that mattered most came from an unexpected source. According to accounts documented in James Hornfisher's research, several Japanese destroyer captains who'd witnessed the battle wrote privately in their journals about the American ship's courage. One entry, translated after the war, noted, "We had expected to fight Americans with superior material and technology. We did not expect to fight Americans with superior spirit. That destroyer charged our battleships as if her spirit alone would carry her through. Perhaps we have misunderstood our enemy." By November 1, 1944, the survivors had been evacuated to rear area hospitals. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, of which Samar was the critical component, had been won decisively. Japanese naval power in the Pacific was broken beyond repair, but the cost had been measured in ships sent to the bottom and men who would never come home. Admiral Clifton Sprague, in his final action report, summarized the battle with characteristic naval understatement. "The failure of the enemy to completely wipe out all vessels of this task unit can be attributed to our successful smokescreen, our torpedo counterattacks, continuous harassment of enemy by bomb, torpedo, and strafing air attacks, timely maneuvers, and the definite partiality of Almighty God." He didn't specifically mention the courage of his destroyer captains, perhaps because such courage seemed beyond words. The sailors who fought off Samar came from every corner of America. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California, fishermen from Massachusetts. They'd enlisted or been drafted, completed abbreviated training programs designed to produce sailors in months rather than years, and found themselves in the middle of the Pacific fighting for their lives aboard ships most had never heard of before assignment. Gunner's mate First Class Robert Billy, who'd kept Johnston's forward gun firing at 23 rounds per minute despite impossible conditions, was a Creek Indian from Oklahoma, serving under Commander Evans, who was Cherokee. Both men had experienced the discrimination Native Americans faced in 1940s America, yet both served with distinction. Billy survived Johnston's sinking and spent 11 hours in the water before rescue. He returned to Oklahoma after the war, rarely spoke about the battle, and died in 1973. His granddaughter later donated his medals to the Oklahoma History Center, where they remain on display. Torpedo Man Second Class William Mercer, who'd launched Samuel B. Roberts' final torpedo spread even as the destroyer escort was sinking beneath him, was 19 years old during the battle. From a small town in West Virginia, Mercer had lied about his age to enlist at 17, desperate to escape poverty and help his family with Navy pay. He survived Sammy B's sinking, but was severely wounded by shrapnel. Rescued after 17 hours in shark-infested water, Mercer spent 8 months in Navy hospitals recovering from his wounds. In interviews given decades later to the Samuel B. Roberts Survivors Association, Mercer described the battle's lasting impact. "I was 19, thought I was invincible, thought war was going to be some kind of adventure. Then you're in the water with oil in your mouth, your shipmates disappearing around you, and you realize how close you came to never seeing 20. Changes you. Makes you understand what's actually important in life." The engineering crews who kept the ships running deserve special recognition. Chief Machinist's mate George Bray aboard Heermann spent the battle in the forward engine room, managing steam pressure and shaft speeds while shells exploded around him. The engine room, below the waterline and surrounded by fuel tanks and magazines, was perhaps the most dangerous duty station on any warship. If the ship was hit and sank quickly, engine room crews had virtually no chance of escape. The hatches above them would be sealed to prevent flooding from spreading. Bray kept Heermann's engines running at flank speed, despite near misses that sprung hull plates and flooded auxiliary spaces. When a Japanese shell penetrated near the forward engine room, the concussion knocked Bray unconscious and ruptured steam lines. He regained consciousness in near total darkness. The lights had failed, with superheated steam filling the compartment. Despite second-degree burns, Bray managed to emergency secure the ruptured lines and restart the engine, giving Heermann the speed she needed to escape the Japanese heavy cruiser that was closing for the kill. Bray survived the war, received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for heroism, and returned to his pre-war job as a mechanic in Philadelphia. He attended every Heermann reunion until his death in 2001, always crediting his engine room crew rather than accepting individual recognition. At his funeral, his former shipmates served as pallbearers, and Heermann's bell, recovered when the ship was scrapped, was rung once for each year of his life. The radio operators also faced unique challenges. Radio Man Second Class Thomas Peterson aboard escort carrier Fanshawe Bay transmitted Admiral Sprague's desperate calls for help while shells from Japanese battleships straddled the carrier. Peterson's compartment in the island superstructure above the flight deck was completely exposed to enemy fire. He maintained communications despite near misses that shattered windows and filled his station with smoke and cordite fumes. Peterson's transmissions, preserved in Naval Archives records, captured the battle's desperation in real time. At 07:55 hours, under attack by major Japanese surface units, 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, request immediate assistance. At 08:20 hours, taking heavy fire, Johnston and Hull engaging enemy. Gambier Bay hit multiple times. At 09:05 hours, Gambier Bay sinking, multiple casualties, destroyers heavily damaged, enemy closing range. Each transmission risked revealing Taffy 3's position to Japanese direction-finding equipment, but Peterson continued broadcasting, knowing that without help, the entire task unit would be annihilated. His messages reached Admiral Halsey 300 miles north, but Halsey's decision to continue pursuing the decoy carrier force meant no immediate help would arrive. Peterson's final transmission from Fanshawe Bay, sent at 0930 hours after the Japanese had begun withdrawing, was simple. Enemy retiring northward. We have survived. The medical personnel aboard the ships faced horrors that no training could prepare them for. Pharmacist's mate second class James Williams aboard Samuel B. Roberts was the destroyer escort's only medical specialist. When the ship was hit repeatedly during her final minutes, Williams worked in the wardroom-turned-aid station treating burns, shrapnel wounds, and traumatic amputations with limited supplies and no surgical capability. According to survivor accounts compiled by the Tin Can Sailors Organization, Williams continued treating wounded even as Samuel B. Roberts began her death roll. He helped carry stretcher cases topside for evacuation, then returned below deck 3 times to ensure no living wounded remained trapped. On his final trip, the ship lurched violently, trapping Williams below as hatches were sealed. He went down with Samuel B. Roberts, one of 90 men lost when the destroyer escort sank. He was 22 years old. The pilots from Taffy 3's escort carriers also deserve recognition for their role in the battle. Ensign John P. Gallagher flew a Grumman Wildcat fighter from the escort carrier Kalinan Bay. When his carrier came under fire, Gallagher was already airborne on anti-submarine patrol. Returning to find his ship under attack by battleships, Gallagher, armed only with 50 caliber machine guns and a single 500-pound bomb, attacked the heavy cruiser Tone. His bomb missed, and his machine gun rounds bounced harmlessly off Tone's armored deck. But Gallagher's attack, along with dozens of similar attacks from other Taffy 3 pilots, forced Japanese ships to maneuver evasively, disrupting their formation and gun solutions. When his ammunition was exhausted, Gallagher made repeated dummy runs, diving toward Japanese ships as if attacking, pulling up only at the last moment. Japanese anti-aircraft fire damaged his Wildcat's engine, forcing him to ditch in the ocean miles from the battle. He was rescued 2 days later by a Navy seaplane. Commander Evans remains the most celebrated figure from the battle, but his crew understood that Johnston's fight was collective, not individual. Boatswain's mate second class Robert Sokor, who survived the sinking and spent 13 hours in the water, later wrote to Evans's widow, "Your husband was the bravest man I ever knew, but he'd be the first to tell you that every man aboard Johnston that morning was brave. The kids manning the guns, the engineers keeping her running, the damage control parties fighting fires. We all knew we probably weren't coming home, and we all kept fighting anyway. The commander gave us courage by his example, but we gave him a crew worth commanding." The racial dynamics of the battle also merit examination. The U.S. Navy in 1944 was still segregated, with African American sailors largely restricted to mess steward and ammunition handling duties. Yet aboard the destroyers and destroyer escorts off Samar, men of all races fought together when the Japanese attacked. Steward's mate First Class Elijah Thomas aboard Hole was manning an ammunition hoist when the destroyer was hit. Despite being wounded by shrapnel, Thomas continued passing 5-inch shells to the gun crews until Hole lost power and the guns fell silent. Thomas survived Hole's sinking and was awarded the Bronze Star for his actions. In post-war interviews, he spoke candidly about the contradiction of fighting for a country that didn't grant him full citizenship rights. "I didn't think about segregation or discrimination when those shells were falling. I thought about keeping my shipmates alive, keeping the guns firing. We were all Americans that morning, all sailors, all brothers. Wish it could have stayed that way when we came home." The battle off Samar produced a unique bond among survivors. Beginning in 1946, survivors from Johnston, Howell, Samuel B. Roberts, Heermann, and the other ships formed the Tin Can Sailors Association. Annual reunions brought together men who'd shared the most terrifying morning of their lives. They maintained contact through newsletters, shared photographs and memories, and ensured that shipmates who died were never forgotten. As veterans aged and passed away, the reunions grew smaller. The last Johnston reunion occurred in 2008, with only 11 survivors able to attend. Robert Billy, the gunner's mate who'd kept the forward mount firing, was there, confined to a wheelchair at 91 but still sharp-minded. When asked what he remembered most about the battle, Billy paused for a long moment before answering. The noise, the constant, overwhelming noise of guns firing, shells exploding, metal tearing. And then the silence after we went into the water, watching Johnston go down. That silence was somehow louder than all the noise that came before. The human cost of the battle off Samar extended far beyond the casualty lists. Wives became widows. Children grew up without fathers. Parents buried sons. Commander Evans's wife, Betty, received notification of her husband's death 3 weeks after the battle. She never remarried, living quietly in Oklahoma until her death in 1982. At her request, she was buried with her husband's Medal of Honor citation and a photograph of USS Johnston taken before the war. The men who fought off Samar carried their experiences differently. Some, like Commander Amos Hathaway, remained in the Navy, eventually retiring as rear admirals. Others, like Lieutenant Commander Copeland, left the service as soon as possible, trying to return to civilian life and forget the morning when they'd ordered teenagers to charge battleships. Many struggled with what today would be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition unrecognized and untreated in the 1940s. What united them all was the knowledge that they'd witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when courage and desperation combined to achieve the impossible, when tiny destroyers charged the largest battleships ever built and somehow survived, when the outnumbered and outgunned defeated the powerful through sheer refusal to surrender. 79 years after the battle off Samar, the legacy of that October morning continues to resonate through naval history. The wreck of USS Johnston was discovered in October 2019 by explorer Victor Vescovo and his team, resting in over 20,000 feet of water, the deepest shipwreck ever located at that time. The discovery brought renewed attention to a battle that many Americans had never learned about, despite its critical importance to the Pacific War's outcome. The underwater footage revealed Johnston resting upright on the seafloor, her hull remarkably intact despite the punishment she'd endured. Her 5-inch gun mounts were still trained outboard, frozen in their final firing positions. The Discovery team noted extensive battle damage, shell holes penetrating her superstructure, entire sections of plating blown away, testament to the punishment she'd absorbed before sinking. Under international maritime law, Johnston and her sister ships remain war graves protected from salvage and disturbance. The discovery prompted the U.S. Navy to hold memorial services honoring Johnston's crew. Rear Admiral Samuel Cox, Director of Naval History, stated, "Johnston and her crew represent the Navy at its finest. Courage in the face of overwhelming odds, selfless sacrifice for mission accomplishment, and unwavering determination against an enemy that should have destroyed them easily. Every naval officer should study this battle and ask themselves, would I have had the courage to make that charge?" The tactical lessons from Samar have been incorporated into U.S. Naval War College curriculum. The battle demonstrates that aggression and initiative can overcome material disadvantage, that confusion and uncertainty affect even superior forces, and that morale and fighting spirit remain critical factors even in modern warfare dominated by technology. The destroyer charge off Samar is studied alongside other famous desperate stands, Thermopylae, the Alamo, Rorke's Drift, as examples of small forces defeating larger ones through courage and tactical audacity. Modern naval officers studying the battle inevitably ask, would contemporary commanders make the same decisions? The question has no easy answer. Commander Evans's charge violated established doctrine, risked his ship unnecessarily, and could easily have resulted in Johnston's destruction without meaningful impact on the battle's outcome. By conventional analysis, his decision was wrong. Yet it worked, and in working it saved thousands of lives and secured a crucial strategic victory. The battle off Samar also raises uncomfortable questions about Admiral Halsey's decisions that morning. His pursuit of the Japanese decoy carrier force, despite intelligence suggesting the main threat was Kurita's battleships approaching San Bernardino Strait, left Taffy 3 completely undefended. Halsey's decision has been debated by historians for decades. Some argue he made reasonable choices based on incomplete information. Others contend he was reckless, prioritizing glory over protecting the invasion force. What's undeniable is that Halsey's error forced the destroyers and destroyer escorts to fight a battle they never should have faced. Had Halsey left even a single division of battleships guarding San Bernardino Strait, Kurita would never have reached Taffy 3. The destroyer charge, while heroic, was necessary only because of higher command failures. The men who died aboard Johnston, Hull, Samuel B. Roberts, and Gambier Bay paid for decisions made far above their pay grades. The cultural memory of Samar has been preserved through multiple channels. James Hornfisher's book, The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, published in 2004, brought the battle to widespread public attention and remained on bestseller lists for months. The book's success demonstrated Americans' hunger for stories of genuine heroism, especially from World War II's forgotten battles. Documentary filmmakers have produced several programs examining the battle. The History Channel's The Battle off Samar, When Destroyers Fought Battleships, aired in 2016, combining survivor interviews with naval historians' analysis. The documentary included footage from the Johnston wreck discovery and helped educate a new generation about the battle's significance. The ships themselves have been memorialized in various ways. USS Johnston, DD-821, a Gearing-class destroyer commissioned in 1946, was named in honor of the original Johnston and served until 1982. Multiple Navy vessels have since carried the names Howell, Heerman, and Samuel B. Roberts, ensuring those ships' legacies continue. The current USS Samuel B. Roberts, FFG-58, an Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigate, carries a plaque describing her namesake's actions off Samar. In Muskogee, Oklahoma, near Commander Evans's birthplace, the USS Johnston Memorial was dedicated in 2016. The memorial features a bronze statue of Evans standing on a destroyer bridge, binoculars in hand, facing west toward the Pacific. At the statue's base, plaques list every crew member who served aboard Johnston during her final battle, with stars marking those who didn't survive. Local schoolchildren maintain the memorial, placing flags on anniversaries and ensuring the story continues being told. The broader strategic impact of the Battle off Samar extended far beyond October 25, 1944. Kurita's failure to destroy Taffy 3 meant the Leyte invasion proceeded successfully. American forces secured the Philippines, cutting off Japanese access to critical resources from Southeast Asia and effectively isolating the Japanese home islands. Some historians argue that securing the Philippines shortened the Pacific War by months, potentially saving hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. For the Japanese Navy, Leyte Gulf represented complete strategic defeat. The combined fleet, which had dominated the Pacific in 1942, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Yamato, the super battleship that should have annihilated Taffy 3, would never again sortie as part of a coordinated fleet action. She was sunk by American carrier aircraft in April 1945 during a suicide mission to Okinawa, dying without firing her main guns at enemy ships. The technological implications of the battle were also significant. Samar demonstrated that battleships, despite their massive guns and armor, were obsolete against determined air and torpedo attacks. The era of the battleship as the dominant naval weapon had ended. Carriers and aircraft would define naval warfare going forward. Ironically, this transition was highlighted by a battle where surface ships, tiny destroyers, made the difference through sheer courage rather than technological superiority. For the families of those who died, the battle's legacy was more personal and painful. Jean Copeland, wife of Samuel B. Roberts's commander, spent years trying to obtain accurate information about her husband's destroyer escort's final minutes. The Navy's official casualty reports were incomplete and sometimes contradictory. Only through correspondence with survivors did she learn the full story of Sammy B's heroic stand. She devoted the remainder of her life to ensuring the ship and crew were properly honored, helping establish the Samuel B. Roberts Survivors Association, and lobbying for the ship's name to be carried forward by future vessels. The Battle off Samar also influenced American popular culture in subtle ways. The image of small ships charging larger ones became a recurring theme in films, novels, and television. The climactic battle in the film Master and Commander echoes Samar's dynamics, a smaller, more maneuverable vessel defeating a larger opponent through aggression and tactical innovation. While not directly based on Samar, the scene captures the same spirit of refusing to accept inevitable defeat. As the last survivors of the battle have passed away, the final Johnston survivor died in 2018. The responsibility for preserving memory has shifted to historians, educators, and military institutions. The U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis includes the Battle off Samar in its curriculum on naval leadership. Midshipmen study Commander Evans's decision to charge without orders, discussing the tension between following doctrine and seizing initiative in crisis situations. The ultimate question raised by the Battle off Samar remains: what drives men to fight beyond reason, beyond hope, beyond any rational calculation of survival? The easy answer is duty, honor, country, the values drummed into every military recruit. But the sailors off Samar fought for something more immediate. They fought for the men beside them, for their shipmates who were depending on them, for the simple human bond forged by shared danger. Commander Evans never wrote a memoir explaining his thinking that morning. He made his decision, charged the Japanese battleships, and went down with his ship. But his actions spoke clearly enough. When faced with impossible odds and certain death, some men choose to fight anyway, not because victory is possible, but because surrender is unthinkable. That choice, repeated across Johnston, Howell, Samuel B. Roberts, and Heermann, changed history. The destroyers and destroyer escorts that charged the Japanese battleships off Samar on October 25, 1944, were built of steel, powered by steam, and armed with guns. But they were crewed by men who possessed something that technology cannot create and doctrine cannot teach: the courage to face death without flinching, to charge when others would flee, to fight when all logic screamed to surrender. That courage won the battle off Samar. That courage saved Taffy 3. That courage secured the Philippines and shortened the war. And that courage echoes still through the decades, reminding us that sometimes the smallest ships carry the greatest heroes, and sometimes the most important victories are won not by the largest guns but by the bravest hearts. The Japanese never expected tiny U.S. destroyers to charge their battleships head-on. Neither did the Americans, until the moment the destroyers turned toward the enemy and opened fire, writing their names forever into the annals of naval history as the bravest of the brave, the small boys who defeated giants through sheer refusal to accept the impossible.